The first thing I remember is the smell. Diesel, brine, and the faint metallic tang of blood from the bait barrels. Anyone who's worked long haul fishing knows that smell. It settles into your clothes, into your hair, into your bones. I'd been around it for 20 years, most of them aboard boats trawling the Gulf of Alaska, but I had never smelled anything like what we found that night. Nothing in all my years prepared me for it. The boat was the Caroline May, a steel trawler older than I was, captained by my friend and occasional pain in the ass, Hank Lawson. Hank was stubborn, loud, and half crazy in the way most lifelong fishermen are. His father died on a trawler in the Bering Sea, and instead of scaring him off the water, it made him hungrier for it. I'd known him since my 20s. He was the kind of man you trusted when things went bad, the kind who kept a level head when other men panicked. That's why what happened still keeps me awake. We were heading southeast out of Kodiak, planning to stay out for 12 days. Our crew was small. Hank, me, a deckhand named Roscoe, who was 45 but looked 60, and two younger guys, Chris and Matt, both in their early 20s, still full of jokes and energy. They were good workers, quick learners. I still think about them the most. The first days went smooth. Weather was better than expected for October. Overcast but calm, long, slow swells rolling in from the west. We pulled up decent hauls, mostly cod and rockfish. Spirits were high. We didn't see another vessel for almost 3 days. That wasn't especially unusual for that stretch, but it felt strange all the same. The Caroline May had radar, of course, but the screen was empty except for the occasional faint return from distant land masses. A whole ocean around us, quiet as sleep. The feeling started on the fourth night. I was in my bunk trying to rest before my wheel shift. The engine's hum usually lulled me, but this time I kept waking up, restless. The boat felt wrong somehow, like it was moving slower than it should, or the waves weren't matching the rhythm they normally did. I couldn't place it. Then I heard footsteps on the deck above me. Not the heavy step of Hank or the clumsy stomp of the younger guys. These were slow, dragging, and moved from bow to stern in a way that didn't make sense with anyone's sleeping schedule. I climbed out of my bunk, pulled on a sweatshirt, and went topside to check. No one was up there. The deck was empty, slick with spray and moonlight. The winch loomed beside me like a steel skeleton. The air was cold enough that each breath hung in front of me. I looked around. Bow, stern, port, starboard. Nothing. But the smell hit me then. Rot, like something had died days ago and been left under the sun. Except it was coming from the water. The breeze shifted and carried it away as quickly as it came, but I stood there, heart pounding. When I went back inside, Hank was in the wheelhouse. He looked up when I walked in. "You wandering around up there?" he asked. "No," I said. "Thought I heard someone on deck." He frowned. "I thought I did too." We stared at each other for a second, both of us trying to brush it off, but unable to. That was the beginning. The next morning, Chris didn't show for his shift. Matt went to wake him, and a minute later, he shouted for us. We rushed to the bunk room and found Chris sitting up in his bunk, staring straight ahead. His skin was pale, and he was shaking like he'd spent the night outside. His eyes kept flicking toward the porthole. "Something was tapping on the glass," he whispered. The porthole was barely a foot above the waterline. "Nothing should be tapping on it." Roscoe snorted, but even he looked uneasy. Probably a loose line or something. I stepped over and checked the outside. No rope, nothing drifting, nothing that could have made that sound. Chris refused to sleep the next night. He paced the deck instead, wrapped in his jacket, watching the waves. That afternoon, the radar picked up something. A ship. No transponder signal. Moving slow, barely drifting. Maybe 600 yards out. Hank and I went topside with binoculars, but the fog had rolled in thick, swallowing the horizon. We could barely see 50 feet. "Probably a dead trawler," Hank muttered. "We'll swing wide." But that evening, the smell returned. Stronger this time. Rot and something chemical, like antifreeze. Matt gagged and leaned over the rail. Roscoe covered his nose with his sleeve. Then Chris pointed. Through the fog, a silhouette emerged. A ship drifting parallel to us, only 20 or 30 yards away. It was a long liner, rusted and half-listing. Windows smashed. No lights. No movement. Hank grabbed the spotlight and lit its deck. We all froze. The deck was smeared with dark stains, thick and layered like something had been dragged back and forth across it. Nets lay tangled, shredded. One of the booms was snapped clean in half. The railing on the port side had been bent outward, as if something had forced its way out. Jesus, Matt whispered. There was a name on the bow, barely visible through the rust. Artemis. I remembered that name. A boat reported missing 3 weeks earlier. 5 men aboard. Should we radio this in? I asked. Hank nodded slowly, but before he could turn, something slammed into our hull. The Caroline May shuddered violently. Matt fell onto the deck. Roscoe grabbed the railing. The sound was enormous, metal grinding, tearing like a car crash underwater. What the hell was that? Hank shouted. Another impact came from the starboard side. The boat lurched. Gear slid across the deck. I ran to the rail and aimed the spotlight at the water. Waves churned, foam twisted, but I didn't see anything solid. Then the light caught something pale, something that disappeared below the surface before I could focus on it. Another hit, this one harder. We scrambled to secure equipment. The engines roared as Hank pushed them to full power. The Caroline May surged ahead, forcing itself away from the drifting Artemis. For a moment the water quieted, then a scream came from the stern. We bolted toward the sound. Chris was gripping the railing, staring at the water. His face was sheet white. It was a hand, he gasped. Something grabbed the rail. It tried to pull itself up. No, Roscoe muttered. No damn way. Then it grabbed him. I don't know how else to describe it. A pale arm shot up from the dark water, fingers long and jointed wrong that they latched around Roscoe's wrist. He screamed and tried to yank free, but whatever was below had strength. Matt and I lunged forward, grabbing Roscoe around his waist and shoulders. The thing pulled harder, dragging him toward the rail. I saw the knuckles, gray-white like drowned flesh. The skin was torn in places, revealing something dark beneath. Then another hand surfaced, and another. "Cut the line!" Hank yelled. There was no line to cut. There was nothing but arms, too many arms, pulling up the side of our boat. "Hold him!" Matt shouted. We did until one of the gray hands shot forward and grabbed Roscoe's throat. His scream choked off. His eyes bulged. I grabbed the nearest thing, an iron hook, and slammed it down on the wrist. Once, twice, 3 times. The hand let go. Roscoe collapsed backward onto the deck, gasping. The other hand slid off the hull and vanished below the surface as the Caroline May roared forward again. We got some distance before anyone spoke. Hank finally whispered, "We're heading back. Now." No one argued, but the ocean wasn't done with us. By midnight, the fog thickened again. The air felt heavier, like we were breathing through wet cloth. The smell came back too, rotting fish and something electric, like burning wires. Chris refused to go below deck. He sat curled up against the bulkhead, humming under his breath. Matt stayed beside him, trying to calm him. Roscoe was silent, staring at the bruises around his throat. Around 2 a.m., I heard scraping. I thought it was the hull against a rogue log, until the scraping moved upward. Slowly, deliberately. Something was climbing the side of the boat. I backed away, heart thundering, and shouted for Hank. By the time he got there, more scraping sounds began, on both sides. "Into the cabin," he ordered. We scrambled inside and locked the heavy steel doors. Matt pulled the curtains across the windows. Roscoe pressed himself against the wall, shaking. Outside, the scraping grew louder. Then came tapping, slow, rhythmic, moving along the length of the cabin. Chris started sobbing. Then something hit the door, a loud, wrenching impact that rattled the frame. Another hit, harder. Metal warped inward. "They're trying to get in," Matt whispered. We backed away as the door bent. The top hinge began to pull loose, screws twisting, metal groaning. The smell flooded into the cabin through the widening gaps. Hank grabbed a flare gun from the emergency cabinet. "If that door opens," he said, "you fire toward the water. Not at them. At the water." "Why?" Matt shouted. "Because I think they're attracted to the light," Hank said, "and sound, and movement. Just don't hit them. I don't know what happens if you hit them." We didn't get a chance to ask more. The door burst inward. Pale limbs shot through the opening. Not human. Too long. Too thin. Skin hanging loose, like it had soaked underwater for too many days. The arms reached blindly, grasping. Matt screamed. Roscoe threw a toolbox. Chris curled into the corner. I grabbed the flare gun from Hank and fired through the broken doorway toward the waves. The flare streaked into the night, and every pale limb recoiled instantly, sliding back into the fog like retreating snakes. Silence swallowed the cabin. We waited, shaking, unable to speak. At dawn, the fog finally thinned. The scraping stopped. The smell faded. We stayed locked in the cabin for hours before daring to go outside. The deck was gouged and slick with seawater. The rails were bent, but nothing else remained. We reached Kodiak 2 days later, exhausted and half delirious. Hank filed a report with the Coast Guard, leaving out the parts that would get us labeled insane. The Artemis was never found again, despite searches. Neither were its crew. Roscoe quit fishing and moved to Idaho. Chris checked himself into a clinic. Matt refused to get on a boat again. Hank kept fishing, but he never went near that stretch of water after dark. As for me, every time I close my eyes, I see those hands, long, pale, reaching. And sometimes late at night, when the wind is right, I swear I can smell that rot again. Story the end. The first time I stepped onto the Margaret Belle, the air smelled like diesel, salt, and the kind of cold that settled into your bones and stayed long after you went back to shore. It was a mid-October morning off the Oregon coast, the sky bruised with the kind of overcast that warned you weather could turn on you fast. I'd signed on for a 2-week run with a crew that was short-handed after one guy broke his ankle and the other quit unexpectedly. The pay was decent, and after a slow summer, I needed it. The captain, an older guy named Harlan Briggs, looked me up and down with pale, watery eyes that reminded me of driftwood. His beard was graying, and a long scar curved across his lower jaw like someone had tried to hook him in the dark. "You worked a trawler before?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied. I'd only worked on crab boats and smaller charters, nothing as big or equipped as the Margaret Belle. But desperation has a way of making you bold, or stupid, depending on how you look at it. He grunted, which I took as approval, and jerked his thumb toward the stern where the others were prepping nets and securing crates. The crew consisted of 4 more men besides the captain and me. There was Dawson, tall and narrow with a nervous energy that made him pace constantly. Jacob, a big guy with sleeves of tattoos and a surprisingly gentle voice. Freddie, older and quiet, the kind who watched more than he spoke. And Murphy, the engineer, who practically lived below deck among the gears and engine hum. The boat shuddered before we left harbor, like it was bracing itself, and something in that vibration unsettled me. But the wage waiting at the end of the trip was enough to push aside doubts. I told myself every boat had quirks. The first 2 days were uneventful, aside from the cold that pressed against us like wet cloth. We hauled in nets heavy with cod and rockfish, and the hours slipped into the kind of exhausting repetition that made your mind dull. The ocean was calm, almost unnaturally so, as if we were floating on a giant sheet of steel. It was the third night that things changed. Around 2 a.m., I climbed out of my bunk to take a leak. The hallway lights flickered now and then, but Murphy said it was just the generator cycling. The smell of fuel was stronger than usual, but on boats, everything smells like fuel eventually. When I climbed the stairs to the deck, I froze halfway up. From outside came a noise like something dragging across metal. Slow, scraping, rhythmic. Not the nets, not chains, not wind. Something heavier. I stood there, listening. The noise came again. It skittered across the hull like nails. I pushed the hatch open and stepped onto the deck. The air was frigid, and fog rolled around the ship in thick, clotted swirls. The deck lights cast milky halos, but beyond them, everything was swallowed in gray. Nothing moved except the boat rocking slightly, but the scraping had stopped. I circled the deck, scanning for a loose chain or crate. Nothing, all secured. Then I saw a shadow near the bow. It was small, maybe the size of a dog, crouched low. I thought maybe a seal had climbed on board. Stranger things had happened, but as I walked closer, something was wrong with the shape. Too upright, too angular. "Hey," I called out, stupidly. The shadow jerked, then slithered over the side so fast I didn't see limbs, just movement. I stumbled back and nearly slipped on the wet deck. My heart hammered, and for a moment, I thought about waking the captain. But how would that conversation go? "Hey, Cap, I saw a shadow that moved weird." I convinced myself it was a trick of fog and fatigue. The next morning, the nets were torn. Not frayed, not snagged, torn, like something with a blade or claws had ripped them open. Hundreds of dollars in damage, maybe more. "What the hell did you do last night?" Dawson snapped at me when we were inspecting them. "Nothing," I said. "I heard something on deck. Fog was too thick. Could have been anything." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "Fog doesn't tear reinforced nylon." Captain Briggs said nothing, just stared at the nets with that watery driftwood gaze and ordered us to repair them. We didn't speak much the rest of the day. That night the ocean changed. The wind died completely, but waves kept hitting us from odd angles as though pushed by something beneath. The fog thickened into a suffocating blanket. Even the radar flickered with static, glitching and showing blips that disappeared when Murphy tapped the console. "Thermal's messing with it," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We dropped the repaired nets anyway. That was our job. Hours later, when we hauled them back up, the smell hit us first. Something rotten, like a dead whale left too long in the sun. The winch whined as the net rose heavy, too heavy, and the surface boiled with murky shapes around it. "What's in there?" Freddie whispered. When the net broke the surface, we recoiled. Dozens of fish, if you could still call them fish, were tangled in the mesh. Their bodies were covered in circular wounds, flesh cored out as if eaten with perfect precision. Some were missing eyes, others had holes bored into their skulls. One fish was still twitching, its head hollowed out like fruit scooped clean. "Parasites?" Dawson asked weakly. "Not any I've seen," Jacob muttered. Then something moved in the net. A shape wriggled deeper in the mass, quick and serpentine. Not big, maybe 2 feet long, but fast. The net bulged where it pressed. "Cut it loose," Briggs ordered sharply. Murphy rushed in with a knife and sliced through the ropes. The whole mess dropped back into the ocean with a sickening splash. But before it disappeared, I saw something break the surface. A pale, hairless limb, no scales, no fins. Something like a hand, but wrong, long fingers webbed lightly with small hooked points at the tips. Then it vanished. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the boat made my nerves twitch. Around 3 a.m., a scream ripped through the hull. We all scrambled onto deck. Dawson was standing near the starboard rail, pale as a ghost. "Something grabbed me," he gasped, holding his right wrist. Blood ran down his arm, dripping onto the deck. 3 thin gashes raked across his skin. "What happened?" Briggs demanded. I heard something in the water. Thought maybe a seal was stuck. I leaned over and something shot up like an arm, pale, fast. It sliced me. Jacob wrapped Dawson's arm while Freddie kept lookout over the railing. None of us saw anything in the fog except shifting gray. "We head back," Jacob said firmly. "This is bad luck. Bad water. Bad something." Briggs shook his head. "We're not turning back over a scrape and some torn nets." "Scrape?" Dawson shouted. "Something grabbed me." Murphy spoke softly. "Captain, the engines have been acting strange since last night. Might be safer to get checked out on shore." Briggs stared at him long and hard, but didn't answer. None of us felt right for the rest of the shift. The boat felt watched, like something moved alongside us in the fog. We found more signs the next morning. Slimy residue smeared across the hull in long streaks. Circular suction marks, small but deep. Something had been climbing. When we showed Briggs, he stared too long before muttering, "Clean it off." His voice was hoarse, quiet. That afternoon, the weather finally broke, but not in the way we hoped. A massive swell slammed the boat sideways, sending crates sliding. The fog churned violently, swirling instead of drifting. The sea groaned, a low sound that vibrated up through the deck. "Storm?" I shouted over the wind. "Radar isn't picking up anything," Murphy yelled back. "This isn't normal." The ocean heaved again, harder this time. Jacob fell to one knee, and that's when we heard it. A screech. Not like any animal I knew. A high, wet, keening sound that made my teeth hurt. It echoed from all sides. Shapes moved in the water. Small at first, then more. Dozens. Pale, slender forms circling the boat. One shot upward, slamming against the hull with a thud. Another followed. Then another. Claws scrape metal. "They're trying to get on board," Freddie screamed. The first creature pulled itself into view. It wasn't a fish, and it wasn't human, eyes black and glossy like polished stones. Skin stretched tight and gray, fingers long and tipped with hooked points. Its mouth was a vertical slit that opened sideways, revealing rows of tiny teeth. It hissed and lunged. Jacob swung a gaff hook and hit it square in the skull. It shrieked and tumbled back into the dark water. But more were climbing. 5, 10. I lost count. Dawson slipped on the wet deck, and one of the things grabbed his leg. He kicked, screaming, and I grabbed his arms, pulling him back while Jacob stabbed at the creature until it let go. It slid into the water, dragging pieces of net with it. The boat rocked violently again, and something massive struck the underside. The deck cracked under the impact. Murphy burst onto the deck, yelling, "The engine's failing! Something's clogged the intake!" Briggs shouted, "Everyone inside, now!" We ran for the cabin as the creatures swarmed the rails, their pale limbs reaching, tapping the metal in a chilling rhythm. One got its fingers around the rail and pulled, testing its strength. Inside, the lights flickered. The hull shuddered. Something bigger than any of the creatures slammed the boat from below. Briggs radioed for help, screaming coordinates into static. We heard the creatures scraping the exterior, circling the cabin. Then silence. Complete, terrifying silence. The boat stopped moving. The fog thinned just enough to reveal something beneath the surface, next to us. Huge, dark, shifting. I saw the suggestion of a shape, far larger than our vessel, just below the waterline. Then it sank slowly out of sight. We didn't speak for a long time. By dawn, the fog started lifting. No creatures in sight. No strange shapes. Just a battered boat and crew shaking like leaves. When the Coast Guard arrived hours later, they found the hull scarred with claw marks, intake blocked with shredded remains of fish, and something else. Something pale. They asked questions. We answered with silence. Who would believe us? The Margaret Bell never went back out after that. Briggs sold her within a month. No one kept in touch after we scattered. But sometimes, late at night when I'm near the coast, I hear that scraping sound in the distance. That slow, deliberate dragging across metal. And I know those things are still out there circling in the fog, waiting for another boat foolish enough to drift into their territory. And I pray they never find one. Story the end. The first time I agreed to work aboard the Marlin Grace, I knew it wasn't the kind of boat that took beginners or men looking for an easy paycheck. It was the kind of vessel that showed up at harbor with dents in the hull, chains worn down to thinning steel, and a crew with the sunken-eyed look of men who had seen things at sea they didn't talk about. But the money was good, better than I'd seen offered anywhere along the Washington coast in months, and I needed it badly enough to ignore every small alarm that went off in my head. The captain, Randall Tate, was a big man with a shaved head, thick shoulders, and scars across his knuckles like he'd been in more fights than he could count. His voice was gravely, and when he asked me if I'd worked long-haul fishing runs before, I told him yes. Another lie I justified with the thought that pulling fish couldn't be that different anywhere. He didn't smile when he hired me. He just grunted and said, "Be on deck at 4. We left the next morning in a thick dawn fog. The other men hardly spoke to me. There were only 4. Mitch, a wiry middle-aged guy with a drooping mustache. Sanders, a solid man built like a refrigerator. Luis, who looked like he was barely 20 but had the calloused hands of someone who spent his whole life around boats. And Clive, who did most of the engine work and barely came up except to eat. The crew didn't laugh, didn't gripe, didn't make small talk. They worked with the slow, practiced rhythm of men trying not to think too much. For the first 18 hours, things were normal enough, hauling gear, setting lines, checking the GPS, listening to the radio squawk with maritime warnings and weather advisories. Tate kept to himself in the wheelhouse, except to bark orders. The sea was calm, a cold expanse of blue-gray. The Marlin Grace cut through it like it had done it 1,000 times before. But that night, something changed. Around 11 p.m., Sanders shook me awake for rotation. My head hurt from the engine's constant thrum and the rocking of the boat, but I forced myself up and climbed onto deck. The cold hit like a fist, and the fog was thicker than it had been all day, a heavy blanket that muffled even the waves. "What's visibility out there?" I asked Mitch, who stood near the stern staring out into the gray. He didn't look at me. "None." I waited for more, but he didn't say another word. We were checking lines when something bumped the underside of the hull. It wasn't a normal bump, not the rolling impact of driftwood or a passing log. It was sharp, deliberate, like something rammed us. "What the hell was that?" I asked. Again, no one answered. Mitch just swallowed hard and looked toward the railing. The water glowed faintly. I thought it was reflection at first, but the light seemed to pulse, dim, bright, dim again, as if something deep below was moving and giving off its own glow. Before I could say anything, Tate came stomping across the deck, his boots echoing. "Pull the lines," he said sharply. "Now." "But we just set these." "Pull them," he repeated, voice rising. "Get us clear of this area." Luis muttered something in Spanish under his breath, but started hauling. The weight was heavier than normal, and the three of us leaned in to pull the line together. When it surfaced, tangled on the hook was a fish I'd never seen before, long and eel-like, with translucent skin and a mouth that opened sideways. Its body still glowed faintly, just like the water. "What is that?" I asked. Tate's face paled. "Cut it loose." Sanders hesitated. The thing twitched violently, its jaw snapping open like a trap. Sanders dropped the line with a curse. "I said cut it loose," Tate barked. Mitch sliced the line, and the creature vanished into the water with a sickening slither. "Start the engines," Tate ordered Clive. "We're moving." No one argued, though no one understood. The tension on deck was like static in the air. For the next hour, we pushed forward slowly through the fog. The pulsing glow under the water faded, and I felt the uneasy relief of someone escaping a bad situation they didn't fully understand. But the relief didn't last. At 2 a.m., another impact hit the hull. Harder. The whole boat shook. Then again, then again. Something rammed us from below with enough force to make metal groan. "What is that?" Luis whispered. I stepped to the railing and leaned over, squinting into the darkness. A shape moved under the water, big, impossibly big. Its outline was indistinct massive like the shadow of a whale. But whales didn't glow, and they didn't circle boats. Luis saw it too. Dios mio. The shape vanished. For a moment the ocean was silent. Then the sound started. It came from the port side, a scraping, grating noise like claws on metal. Slow, long, deliberate. Clive burst from below deck, face white. "We're losing pressure in the intake. Something's clogging." His words were cut off by a loud metallic bang beneath the boat. The deck vibrated. The engines sputtered. "Kill the engines," Tate ordered sharply. "What?" Clive shouted. "We're sitting ducks without. Kill them." The moment the engines died, a horrific chorus of scraping sounds filled the silence. Dozens of small impacts rattled the hull. Clack, clack, clack. Like something was tapping, testing, or climbing. Luis backed away from the rail, whispering prayers. Sanders grabbed a gaff hook, sweat dripping down his face despite the cold. I forced myself to look over the side. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed the pale shapes clinging to the hull. 3 of them, each the size of a child but twisted, long-limbed, with translucent skin stretched over bones. Their eyes were oversized and black, reflecting our deck lights like polished stones. One lifted its head at me. Its mouth opened vertically first, then horizontally, revealing rows of needle teeth arranged in a spiral. It hissed, a wet sound that made my stomach flip. "Get away from there," Sanders yelled. But it was too late. One of the creatures leapt. It grabbed the rail, claws digging into metal, and pulled itself onto deck. Luis screamed and stumbled back. The thing lunged with unnatural speed. Sanders swung the gaff hook and caught it in the torso. The creature shrieked, a sound that cut straight through me, and its skin split open like parchment. A clear, jelly-like fluid sprayed across the deck. Mitch and I pushed it overboard, but more were climbing up. 5, 6, 8. Dozens of pale shapes moving across the metal like spiders. Tate fired a flare gun into the nearest cluster. The bright flash illuminated their bodies, raw, translucent, their organs visible through thin skin. They scattered, hissing, but others kept coming. One latched onto Luis's leg. He screamed as its teeth sank into his calf. Blood poured down his boot. Sanders tackled Luis and beat the creature with the gaff hook until it snapped like brittle glass. Clive yelled from the stern, "They're climbing the nets! They're everywhere!" Tate roared, "Back inside the wheelhouse! Move!" We ran, dragging Luis between us. The creatures scrambled across the deck behind us, tapping the metal with their claws. We slammed the wheelhouse door shut and locked it. But the noises outside didn't stop. Claws scratching, bodies slapping the hull, their shrill cries. Luis was pale, shaking violently from blood loss and shock. Mitch tied a belt around his leg as a makeshift tourniquet, but it didn't stop the trembling. "They're trying to get in," Clive whispered. He wasn't wrong. Pale hands slid across the wheelhouse windows, tapping, tapping, tapping. Their huge eyes stared in at us, unblinking, hungry. Then the boat rocked violently, harder than before. Something enormous rose beneath us. Through the fogged window, I saw the water bulge. A massive dark shape surfaced, barely visible but unmistakable. It dwarfed the Marlin Grace. A maw-like void opened beneath the water, rows of long, barbed tendrils reaching upward. The smaller creatures scrambled toward it. But they weren't fleeing. They were returning. feeding. The giant shape began pulling itself higher. The boat tipped, glass cracked. Clive screamed that we were going to capsize. Tate grabbed the radio, shouting for help, but the only response was static. Sanders braced himself against the console. If that thing rolls us... The boat lurched to the right, throwing us all off balance. Loose gear slid across the floor. Luis collapsed completely, unconscious. The hull groaned, metal warping from the pressure of the thing pushing against us. Then, in an instant, the massive shape slipped back beneath the surface. The boat snapped upright so fast we nearly cracked our heads on the ceiling. For several seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The water outside went still. The tapping stopped. The pale hands vanished. All at once the fog began to thin, slowly peeling away like a curtain. The first hint of a bruised dawn sky appeared on the horizon. Tate was the first to speak. "Start the engines," he said hoarsely. "Now, before it comes back." Clive nodded shakily and ran below deck. The engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. We didn't even haul in our gear. Tate gunned the throttle, and the Marlin Grace sped toward the nearest harbor like a wounded animal fleeing a predator. None of us spoke the entire way back. We brought Luis to the hospital. He lived, but he never walked normally again. He wouldn't talk about what happened. None of us did. When the Coast Guard inspected the Marlin Grace, they noted deep gouges along the hull, but chalked it up to scraping against underwater rock formations. We quit the boat, every one of us, within a week. The Marlin Grace was eventually sold off. I heard it capsized the next year on a winter run. No survivors. Official reports blamed a sudden squall. But I know what really happened. Sometimes when I stand at the shore late at night, I see a faint glow beneath the water, slow, pulsing, moving. And I know it's still out there, waiting for another ship, waiting for another crew, waiting for whoever drifts too long in the wrong patch of ocean. Story the end. Salt spray kept slapping across the railings and misting the deck. And by the time we'd cleared the lightless mouth of the harbor, the sky over the Pacific had already turned the color of cold iron. I had been working on boats for almost 10 years at that point. Deckhand on everything from lazy charter vessels to tuna longliners. But the Merrimack Dawn was different. She was older, heavier, and louder than anything I'd served on. And the men who crewed her were the kind who'd been carved out of storms. Nobody on board wasted breath on small talk. Nobody smiled much, and nobody ever mentioned the ship's last voyage, though every man on her seemed to know something about it. I came aboard in Westport, Washington, replacing a deckhand who'd quit mid-contract. The skipper only said the man couldn't handle the night work, and that was that. We pushed out just before sunset on a 4-day run up the coast to chase a series of deep-water cod lines. The air stank of diesel and bait fish, the gulls wheeled overhead screaming, and every loose bolt rattled like bones in a bucket. It felt normal enough, at first, but the first night changed everything. I was on the stern, coiling wet rope, when I noticed the smell. Not brine, not bait, not diesel. Something sour. Something that reminded me vaguely of a wharf dumpster in mid-August, but deeper. Almost like the smell of a wound. It drifted across the deck in a warm, sluggish wave, thick enough to seem oily in the throat. I turned to ask Pete, the oldest deckhand, if something had spoiled in the holds, but he just kept staring out toward the water as if he hadn't heard me. "You smell that?" I asked. He didn't look away from the dark sea. "Ignore it," he said. "Does it happen often?" He coiled his rope slower, almost delicately. "Just work. Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to." That didn't help, but the man didn't say another word, so I let it go. For the moment. Later that night, long after most of the deck had gone quiet, I was in my bunk reading when the Merrimack Dawn shuddered violently under my feet. It was the sort of jolt that felt like something had hit us, or like we'd hit something else. The overhead lights flickered. The engine groaned in a way I'd never heard a machine groan, and for a breath-long moment the entire hull seemed to shift sideways. Then it stopped. Someone pounded on the bulkhead outside the bunks. It was the skipper. "Everyone topside!" he barked. "Now!" I scrambled up the ladder, not knowing if we'd struck debris or were taking on water. But when I got on deck, the sea was calm as far as the moonlight reached. No floating logs, no sandbars, no signs of impact at all. "What happened?" I asked Pete, who was tightening his gear. "Something brushed the keel," he muttered. "Like what?" He shrugged, but his eyes flicked to the water. Doesn't matter. Happens on this boat. The skipper did a sweep of the hull with a long-handled spot lamp. When the beam cut across the water, the surface seemed strangely cloudy, almost thick, like diluted milk swirling around our wake. But whenever I tried to stare directly at any part of it, it just looked like normal seawater. Then, just as the skipper lowered the lamp, something broke the surface maybe 30 yards off the starboard bow. It was quick, a shape rising, then sinking again. But in that split second, I saw something long and pale slide back beneath the black water, longer than any fish we were supposed to see this far north. Longer than any fish I'd ever seen, period. What the hell was that? I whispered. Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to. We went back to work at dawn. The ocean was calm, the sky clear, but the mood on deck sat heavy, drowned in a silence that didn't belong on a working boat. I noticed little things. Tiny grooves scratched into the hull that hadn't been there the day before, rope fibers frayed like they'd been tugged on, bait tubs knocked over despite being lashed down. By midday, the sour smell had returned, this time drifting out from the starboard stern where the last of the overnight catch was being iced. The skipper blamed a burst bait bag, but I'd seen those dozens of times. This was something else, something older, something wrong. The next night, the real trouble began. Around 2 a.m., when the ship was running slow while lines were reset, I was hauling up a set of hooks when I felt a faint vibration run through the cable. Not from waves or snagged debris. This felt like something tugging from below. Something heavy, something alive. Got a live one, I called to the others. Pete came over to help crank the winch. Keep tension steady, he said. But the line jerked again, harder. The cable twanged loud enough to echo across the water. That ain't a fish, Pete muttered. Before I could ask what he meant, the deck lights flickered and the smell hit us again, stronger than ever, like rot soaking through a tarp. Pull it in, the skipper shouted from the wheelhouse. We tried. The winch groaned. The cable screamed. Then suddenly, whatever was holding it let go. We stumbled backward as the tension vanished. The cable snapped up from the water like a released spring. But something came up with it. Lodged on the last hook was a strip of flesh. Gray, rubbery, and thick. Much too thick for fish skin. It looked like it belonged to something much larger, and it glistened with a slimy sheen that dripped onto the deck in ropes of mucus. What the hell is that? I breathed. Pete swallowed, his face pale under the deck lights. We're cutting it loose. But before he could reach for his knife, the ship lurched violently to port. Men stumbled. Gear crashed. A spare oxygen tank rolled straight across the deck and slammed into the railing, hard enough to dent it. Then something slammed the hull from below. Once. Twice. A third time, so hard the deck vibrated. Inside! The skipper yelled. Everyone inside! Move! We barely made it through the bulkhead door when the ship tilted sharply, nearly throwing us against the far wall. The metal groaned. Bolts strained. Somewhere deep in the engine room, something snapped with the sound of cracking bone. What's hitting us? I shouted. The skipper didn't answer. He just grabbed the radio and tried to call in a mayday, but all that came through was static broken by a low, warbling tone, something too rhythmic to be interference and too organic to be machinery. The ship rocked again. Then everything went still. Every man in the cabin looked around cautiously. The skipper checked the bilge gauges. Pete tightened his grip on his knife. The engines thumped unevenly, struggling to keep a steady rhythm. After a long minute, the skipper took a breath. We go out slow, he said. See if we're taking water. We stepped back onto deck. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. Even the waves seemed muted, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. The strip of gray flesh was still lying where it had fallen, except now there were marks around it. Marks shaped like fingers. Long ones. Too long. Someone touched this? I asked. No, Pete said flatly. The skipper knelt down, squinting at the deck. These aren't from boots. A splash cut him off. We all spun toward the port side railing. Nothing was there. But the sour smell thickened so suddenly that a couple of the guys gagged. Another splash. This one closer, right against the hull. Then a hand grabbed the rail. Gray. Misshapen. Fingers too long, too jointed, stretching across the metal like pale roots. I froze. Another hand appeared next to it. The skipper shouted, "Inside! Now!" But the thing was already pulling itself up. I only saw it for a second, but that second will stay with me until I die. A face, if you could call it a face, rose into view. Eyes black and lidless, skin stretched thin over something that moved underneath, gills fluttering open and closed like rotten petals, a mouth that didn't so much open as split. It made a noise like breath being sucked through waterlogged wood. Then Pete lunged at it with his knife. The blade stabbed deep into the creature's shoulder. It didn't even flinch. It looked at him, looked through him, and then it grabbed him. It moved too fast to follow. One moment Pete was standing, the next he was being dragged over the rail. His boots scraped the deck, kicking wildly, and his scream cut through the night like a flare. We rushed forward, but by the time we reached the rail, both he and the creature were gone. The ocean below churned, but we saw nothing. Not a single bubble. The skipper shut down all deck operations after that. He ordered every door sealed and every man accounted for. But the night wasn't done with us. Hours later, in the dead dark just before dawn, the banging started again. Soft at first, a dull tapping from the hull, then harder, faster, as if dozens of hands were drumming along the sides, searching for a way in. Men prayed under their breath. One of the younger deckhands sobbed quietly. The skipper gripped the wheel and muttered that the engines were failing. Something in the water was fouling the intake. We didn't stop until sunrise. When the first pale light broke across the waves, the tapping finally ceased. As if whatever lived in the dark hated the sun. We limped back toward shore on damaged engines, every man silent. No one spoke Pete's name. Nobody dared look too long at the water. We reached port by late afternoon. The Coast Guard inspected the ship. They found structural dents, strange grooves carved into the hull, and salt water inside sealed compartments. But no sign of Pete. No sign of the creature. No sign of anything that could explain the night. They called it an accident. They always do. I quit that same day. Sometimes, when I wake up before dawn, I swear I can still smell that sour rot drifting through my bedroom window. Faint, almost imaginary, but real enough to turn my stomach. And sometimes I dream of the Merrimack dawn drifting through dark water, slowing as something brushes the keel. Something patient, something hungry, something that knows boats come back and that men do too. Story the end. The Atlantic in late October is unforgiving. The wind bites through layers of clothing and the waves can rise taller than a man. That's what made the Fisher's Pride a dangerous boat even before what happened. She was a 60-foot steel-hulled trawler, built in the 50s and patched so many times it was almost impossible to tell where old steel ended and new began. Captain Roy Simmons had been fishing these waters for over 30 years, and the rest of the crew, me, Sam, Red, and two deckhands, Jimmy and Carl, trusted him because he knew every hidden reef and shifting sandbar along the Massachusetts coast. We left Gloucester Harbor at dawn, the smell of diesel thick in the cold morning air. The first day out was rough but ordinary. High waves, wet decks, and cold that seeped through even the warmest layers. We hauled nets heavy with cod, our hands blistered and raw, and everyone stayed silent during the long stretches between catches. That night, the wind died down and the ocean became unnervingly calm, like it had stopped moving entirely. I was on night watch, leaning against the rail and staring into the black water. That's when I noticed it, a faint glow beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was the reflection of a buoy or some bioluminescent plankton, but it moved, slow, deliberate, circling the boat in patterns that didn't make sense. I called out to Red, who was in the wheelhouse. "Hey, you seeing this?" Red leaned out. "It's probably nothing. Fish? Jellyfish? Don't get your head stuck imagining things." But I knew it wasn't ordinary. The glow seemed intelligent, deliberate, as if something was observing us. The next day, we found the largest school of cod any of us had ever seen. The sonar lit up like a Christmas tree, and Captain Simmons practically shouted in excitement. The net went down, and we worked quickly, hauling it in with practiced efficiency. That's when things got strange. The net came up heavier than usual. At first, we assumed it was the fish, but the catch smelled wrong. Thick, metallic, sour. When the net broke the surface, we saw why. Most of the fish were bloated and pale, their scales marred with black circular lesions. Some had open wounds, not from nets or hooks, but as if something had eaten them from the inside. Then we noticed the other things. Long, pale strips of flesh-like material, glistening wet and twisting as if alive. At first I thought it was seaweed, but the way they moved was deliberate. One of them twitched toward Red as he reached for it with a gaff. He yelped and fell back, sliding on the slick deck. Captain Simmons shouted for everyone to get back. "Leave it! Dump the damn thing!" We did. The strips fell back into the water, but that didn't end it. The boat shuddered as if something massive had slammed into it. The hull groaned, and water sloshed over the side. Sam checked the engines. "Nothing's wrong down here," he said, but I could hear the tension in his voice. We tried to keep moving, heading west toward deeper waters. By nightfall, the glow returned, brighter and closer. The things weren't floating aimlessly anymore. They were circling us, and their movements were coordinated, deliberate. They brushed the hull lightly, then withdrew, as if testing us, sizing us up. Then the first tentacle broke the surface. It was enormous, translucent, pulsing with the same eerie light. It wrapped around the rail and tried to climb onto the deck. Jimmy swung a gaff at it, and the tentacle absorbed the metal like it wasn't solid. When it touched the deck, it left a corrosive slime that sizzled against the steel. Captain Simmons tried to start the engines, but the boat shuddered violently. The creature's mass pressed against the hull, bending the steel in ways it shouldn't bend. Another tentacle reached for Jimmy. He screamed as it wrapped around his torso, dragging him toward the water. Red and I tried to pull him back, but it was too strong. Within seconds, Jimmy was overboard, his screams cut short by the waves. We backed away, retreating to the wheelhouse. The tentacles thrashed violently, pulling at the hull, bending the deck, splintering wood where it could. Sam was yelling from the engine room that he could jury-rig the generator for emergency power, but it wasn't fast enough. The attack went on for what felt like hours. Every time one of the creatures touched the boat, the metal groaned and bent, and the slime ate into everything it touched. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The creatures sank beneath the surface, leaving behind nothing but the corrosive residue on the deck and the smell, sour, metallic, and rotten. We were silent for a long time, catching our breath. The Fisher's pride was damaged, but still afloat. Captain Simmons looked at the water, pale and quiet. "They're out there," he said softly. "Always watching. Always waiting." By dawn, Sam had gotten partial power to the engines, and we limped back toward Gloucester Harbor. The water was calm again, almost unnaturally so, and every shadow beneath the waves felt alive. When we reached port, we told the Coast Guard a story about a mechanical failure and a bad storm. They asked questions, but we stuck to the mundane explanation. No one would have believed us anyway. I quit fishing after that trip. Red left shortly after. Sam still works on boats, but stays close to the harbor now. Captain Simmons went out again, of course. He never could stay away. But I know he's different. He doesn't laugh much anymore. He doesn't joke with the new crew. And I know the truth. I've seen what lurks beneath the Atlantic. I've felt it wrap around the hull of a boat. I've heard the screams of a man dragged into the water, and I've smelled the corrosive metallic stench that clings to the deck long after the creatures are gone. Sometimes at night, I dream of the glow beneath the waves. I dream of the tentacles reaching, of Jimmy's scream, of the boat groaning as it nearly buckled under the creature's weight. And I wake up sweating, certain that somewhere out there, in the cold black water, they are still waiting for the next ship, foolish enough to wander into their territory. No one believes me. No one wants to. But I know. Story the end. The Eleanor May had been making trips off the coast of Maine for over 30 years. She was a weathered trawler, paint-peeling, wood-warped by years of salt and storms. Despite her appearance, she was sturdy, and the men who worked her trusted her like a living thing. I was only 19 when I signed on, eager to earn my first real wages and taste the life my father had always romanticized. He had fished these waters, and the stories he told were full of danger, but none of them prepared me for what happened aboard the Eleanor May that spring. Captain Harris was a tall man, broad shoulders, and a permanent squint from the Atlantic sun. He ran a tight ship, and every order he gave was followed without question. The crew was small, just 5 of us besides him. Tom, the seasoned deckhand who had been on the boat for decades. Billy, a wiry young man with more enthusiasm than sense. Jake, quiet, dependable, and suspicious of everything. And Carl, the cook, a man of few words but strong hands. I was the newest, and they treated me like an extra set of eyes and hands, which was exactly what I was. We left Portland on a morning that seemed ordinary. The sky a pale gray, the sea calm. Our first 2 days were routine. Nets heavy with haddock, cod, and a few unusual mackerel. The wind was steady, and the engines hummed a rhythm that felt almost comforting. But by the third day, the fog rolled in, thick and unnatural, like swallowing the horizon in a gray wall that reflected nothing back. The radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. I felt a weight in the air, a sense of being watched, though none of us said it aloud. It began subtly at first. A low vibration ran through the hull, almost imperceptible, like the ship itself was shivering. Tom noticed it first. "Feel that?" he asked, leaning against the railing. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else. That night, the sound became clear. Tap, 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 metal striking metal, echoing from below. Someone walked the deck. We all froze, hearts hammering. No one was there. Flashlights swept the deck, but the fog swallowed everything beyond 10 feet. Captain Harris ordered us below, dismissing it as the wind, though his jaw was tight, and I caught a flicker of unease in his eyes. The next morning, we hauled in the nets, and what we found turned my stomach. Fish, but unlike any we'd seen. Their eyes were opaque, milky, and their bodies bore strange lesions, long, thin gashes that looked like they'd been burned or chewed. Billy gagged and dropped a fish overboard. Captain Harris said nothing, simply gesturing for us to toss the rest back into the water. Even now, I remember the sound of their pale bodies hitting the waves and floating for an unnaturally long time before sinking. By the 5th day, things escalated. The fog thickened to the point that visibility was nearly zero. The compass spun erratically, pointing to nowhere. Then came the whispering on the radio, a single guttural word repeated over and over: "Return." We all heard it, though none of us responded. Captain Harris tried to call out, asking where, but the voice only repeated, low and hollow. That night, a storm arrived. Not the usual Atlantic rage we expected. This was different. Waves rose higher than the bow, smashing into the hull with a force that made the ship groan and shudder. The deck became a chaotic mess of nets, ropes, and equipment. Amid the roaring of wind and water, we heard it, something pounding from below, not the engine, something deliberate. The hull shook as if being tested, like an animal sizing us up. By morning, only 4 of us remained. Tom had disappeared, swept overboard during the night, no scream, no splash, just gone. Billy was pale and silent, standing at the railing as the fog swallowed him in its gray haze. Carl and I clung to the wheelhouse, watching shapes beneath the waves, long, sinuous shadows that slid just beneath the surface. Fish? No. Something else, larger, intelligent, and malevolent. Captain Harris tried to steer us back toward open waters, but the compass betrayed him. It spun endlessly, refusing to settle. The fog didn't thin. It became heavier, thicker, pressing against the hull like a living wall. Shadows danced beneath the deck, and every so often, a shape would rise to the surface, pale, slick, moving with the unnatural grace of a predator. On the 7th day, the horrors became physical. Carl was on deck, checking the nets when the fog seemed to reach up and snatch him. One moment he was just adjusting a line, the next he was gone, pulled into the gray void by something unseen. His screams echoed for seconds before the fog swallowed them. Captain Harris ordered me to stay inside. I tried to argue, but he looked at me with that look, calm, resolute, and full of fear, and I obeyed. I heard the footsteps next. Slow, deliberate, on the deck above me, circling the cabin. I ran to the window, shone my flashlight into the fog, and froze. Shapes, dozens of them, undulating beneath the waves, their eyes reflecting back like wet stones. Then one broke the surface entirely, tall, humanoid, yet elongated, skin slick and reflective. It studied me, tilting its head in a way no human could. I stumbled back, heart racing, realizing that this wasn't a storm or hallucination or even a trick of the fog. Something alive, something ancient and intelligent was here. Captain Harris joined me, flare gun in hand. "We're not getting out the way we came," he said. "We'll have to run. Engines full, break through the fog." We tried. The engine roared, but the fog thickened around us, shapes pressing close enough that we felt them in the water. The deck shuddered as something large brushed against the hull, leaving deep scratches in the wood. The flare gun lit the shadows briefly, but when the flare faded, the shapes were still there, surrounding us, patient. By the 9th day, exhaustion and fear had set in. The fog was constant, the sea unnaturally calm, as if it were waiting. Captain Harris had lost 2 more men, Billy and Tom, gone without a trace. Only he and I remained. Food and water were running low. We no longer spoke, only moved mechanically, knowing every sound, every shadow could mean death. Then the whispers returned. The radio crackled, faint at first, then louder. Return. Harris spoke into it, asking where, and the fog seemed to pulse in response, almost like it inhaled. The shapes beneath the waves became more frequent, closer, circling, watching, learning. The 10th night, I stayed at the wheelhouse while Harris went to check the deck. That was the last I saw him. A shadow rose from the water, tall, impossibly thin, moving with eerie grace. Harris shouted, and I aimed the flare gun, but the shadow vanished before the flare could ignite. Moments later, Harris was gone, pulled into the fog without a sound. I was alone. The next day, I drifted, barely conscious, until a Coast Guard vessel spotted me miles from where we had last charted the Eleanor May. The ship was gone, vanished without a trace. The men, my crew, gone. The fog had lifted, leaving only the cold Atlantic and the remnants of what had happened. Even now, years later, I hear it. Low vibrations against the hulls of other boats, the whispering static on the radio, the tap, tap, tap of footsteps in empty fog. And sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can see those long, pale shapes beneath the waves, waiting, patient, intelligent, and still hungry. Story the end. The Islander left Gloucester Harbor just before dawn, its engine grumbling like an old man waking from a long sleep. The fog hung low over the water, and the gulls were still silent, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. I had worked on a handful of boats in my life, but something about the Islander felt different. She wasn't old by any measure, built in the mid-'80s, but there was a weight to her, a kind of tiredness that seemed almost human. Our crew was small. Captain Reed, a stout man in his 50s with the hands and eyes of someone who had spent decades at sea. His son, Tommy, 24, wiry and quick, though too young to have seen the kinds of things his father had. Joe, the deckhand, quiet and methodical. And me, the newest, barely 2 months on the job. The first hours were routine. We steamed out past Stellwagen Bank, cutting through black water slicked with the morning fog. The wind was light, the swells gentle, but even in the calm, the water seemed wrong. It rolled unpredictably, rising and falling without reason, almost as if something large moved beneath it. The air was metallic, thick with the smell of brine and decay. By mid-morning, we had our first tow set. The net sank quickly, and the winch hummed as we fed it out. At first, everything seemed normal. Cod, haddock, the occasional flounder. But the tension on the cable started climbing far beyond what it should have been. Joe muttered, "She's pulling like hell." Captain Reed came over, squinting at the gauge. "Bottom's soft. Nothing down there should be pulling this hard." But the winch kept shuddering, vibrating along the deck like it was alive. Then the first thing broke the surface. A slab of wood, thick, warped, encrusted with barnacles. Then another, and another. When the net finally broke the surface, it was full of debris. Rotten timber, rusted chains, and twisted rope. But at the center was something that made the deck go silent. A figurehead, carved like a woman, her hollow eyes staring at us, mouth frozen in a scream, seaweed hanging from her head. Joe crossed himself. Tommy turned pale. Even Captain Reed hesitated as he gripped the figurehead, which felt unnaturally cold, almost heavy with presence. We tried to ignore it. We tossed the rest of the debris back overboard and lashed the figurehead to the deck. But the sea had changed. The swells became jagged, irregular, slapping the hull with more force than the wind justified. The fog thickened, swallowing the horizon. The gulls that usually hovered above stayed far away, circling at strange angles, never diving. By mid-afternoon, the first knocks started. At first faint, 3 taps against the hull below deck. Tommy froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Reed grunted, a warning, but didn't answer. The knocks came again, louder, followed by a scraping sound along the starboard side, metal on metal, like fingernails raking steel. Joe muttered something under his breath and went below to check the bilge. He didn't return. Night fell quickly. The storm Reed had predicted hit sooner than expected. Winds screamed, waves slammed the hull, but it wasn't just the weather that frightened us. The knocking moved from below deck to the rigging, to the deck itself, and finally to the figurehead. Each knock made it tilt slightly, as if responding. Tommy was shaking. "Captain, we need to leave. Now." Reed gripped the wheel, jaw tight. "We survive together. We wait." Even he didn't sound certain. Around midnight, a massive shadow rose from the water beside the islander. Too long, too wide for any whale, moving with impossible precision. A single pale eye opened, massive, unblinking, staring directly at us. Its roar vibrated through the hull, freezing us in place. The net cable snapped, whipping across the deck, sparks flying as it struck metal. The deck tilted violently under the force of the waves that followed. Reed ordered the engine to full, but the boat barely moved. The rudder felt stuck, as if something below was holding it. The creature surfaced again, closer this time, limbs or fins coiling around the hull, its single eye following every movement. Tommy fired a flare gun, the red light slicing through the fog. The creature recoiled, but the water around us churned violently. We fought the storm and the beast for hours. Decks shook with every blow, water washing over rails and gear. The figurehead creaked violently, splintering slightly under the stress. Reed kept the wheel, guiding the islander with steady hands, but his face was pale, eyes haunted. By dawn, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the scale of the damage. The stern was broken, the deck flooded, the hull splintering. The creature circled, patient, waiting. Joe had disappeared completely. Tommy was clinging to debris, and I held on to him, my arms numb from cold. Reed's voice came faintly from the wheel, then silence. He was gone, taken in a surge of water as the creature smashed against the stern one final time. The islander broke apart, leaving Tommy and me floating among wreckage. Hours passed. I saw shapes moving under the water, long and pale, circling us, but none touched us. When the Coast Guard finally arrived near mid-morning, they pulled me from the water, hypothermic and barely alive. Tommy had disappeared, and no trace of him or the boat was ever found. The official report called it a storm and structural failure. That was easier to accept than telling the truth. I never went back to sea. I never saw a boat again without feeling the weight of those eyes beneath the waves. At night, sometimes, when the wind is still and the water dark, I swear I hear the tapping, the scraping, and the faint creak of the figurehead waiting for the next fool to disturb the deep. Story the end. The Mariner's Call had been docked at the port in Gloucester for weeks, its hull streaked with rust and the smell of old fish clinging to every inch. I signed on as a deckhand mostly out of desperation. Work was slow back home in Maine, and money didn't grow on trees. The captain, a man named Jeb Thompson, was the kind of guy whose face had been carved by decades at sea. His eyes were pale, almost icy, and they had that look of someone who had seen things he didn't talk about. He didn't ask me much about my experience. He just nodded and said, "You get on board, you do what you're told. Simple." The crew was small, 4 men besides me and the captain. There was Callahan, who looked like he had spent his whole life on boats, weathered and silent. Mark, young and nervous, always fiddling with his gloves. Pete, stocky and strong, who barely spoke unless necessary. And the engineer, Roy, a quiet man who spent more time in the engine room than anywhere else. The first 2 days out were routine. We set lines, checked nets, and hauled in a fair catch. The Atlantic was gray, restless, and the wind bit at any exposed skin, but we settled into the rhythm. Nights were long, cold, and dark, and fatigue made the mind wander. I began noticing the little things. The way the boat seemed to groan more than it should, or how the fog rolled in thicker than anyone I'd sailed with remembered. It started on the 3rd night. I was on deck alone checking lines when I noticed something moving beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a seal or maybe a large fish, but the movement was wrong, too deliberate. It circled the boat in slow, calculated arcs. Then I heard the first sound, scraping along the hull. Not the nets, not the waves, something else. A slow, metallic rasp that like claws dragging across steel. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Callahan appeared from the shadows and muttered, "She's awake." I didn't understand, but I felt it immediately. The Mariner's Call wasn't just a boat tonight. It felt alive, aware, under some unseen pressure. By morning, we discovered the first damage. Nets were shredded, torn in ways that no storm or careless handling could have caused. Some of the fish we hauled in were mutilated, flesh stripped from their bodies in clean, precise lines, eyes missing, gills torn. Strange pieces of something pale and rubbery, like translucent skin, were tangled in the nets. Roy swore he saw one pulse before we threw it back. Captain Thompson didn't comment. He just ordered us to clean up and move on. That night, the fog returned, heavier than before. I was on watch with Mark when I saw the first creature. It broke the surface silently, long, pale, and humanoid in shape, but wrong in every way. Its limbs were too long, its fingers tipped with hook points, its eyes black and lidless. Its jaw opened sideways, revealing jagged rows of teeth. I stumbled back, tripping over a coil of rope, and it hissed, a wet, metallic sound that cut straight through my chest. Mark screamed and dropped the flashlight, which flickered weakly across the fog. The creatures multiplied. Dozens appeared from the water, circling, tapping, testing the deck rails. They climbed aboard with unnatural speed, long limbs scraping against the metal. Pete swung a gaff hook, hitting one in the torso. It shrieked, a sound that made my teeth ache, and fell back into the water. Another leapt, landing on the railing, claws digging into the deck, teeth bared. We fought desperately, but there were too many, and they were fast, intelligent, almost methodical. Captain Thompson fired a flare gun into the fog, the bright light illuminating the creatures in sickly red. They hissed and retreated momentarily, slipping back beneath the water. But I knew they weren't gone. They were circling, watching, waiting. By dawn, the deck was chaos. Nets shredded, blood smeared across steel, gouges carved deep into the hull. Mark's arm was cut badly, Pete had bruises across his torso, and even Callahan looked shaken. Roy reported engine intake issues. Something had clogged the machinery with an unidentifiable substance. Captain Thompson didn't speak. He just ordered us to keep moving toward open water. The following nights were worse. The fog rolled in thick and fast, and the creatures came back every night, more numerous and aggressive. They seemed to communicate, clicking and screeching in patterns we couldn't understand. Sometimes we'd see one rise from the water alone, inspect the hull, and then disappear, only for more to arrive moments later. One night, something huge pressed against the boat from beneath. The hull groaned as though it were bending under impossible weight. The smaller creatures retreated into the depths as if acknowledging a master. We didn't know what it was, too large for any known whale, too controlled for any natural predator. The boat shuddered violently, throwing nets and gear across the deck. Water splashed over the rails, cold and heavy. The creatures tapped and scratched, testing the hull, but they didn't climb this time. They seemed almost obedient, waiting for something we couldn't see. One by one, the crew began to crack. Mark refused to go on deck, shaking uncontrollably. Pete became aggressive, lashing out at anyone who came near him. Even Callahan, usually stoic, started muttering prayers. I tried to stay focused, but exhaustion and fear made every shadow a threat, every ripple a signal of the things beneath. The final night was the worst. A storm rolled in suddenly, the sea heaving violently, wind tearing at the rigging. The fog was so thick it felt like walking through solid cotton. Then, from the depths, the massive shape rose again, larger than the boat, its body glistening pale in the flashes of lightning, surrounded by the smaller creatures. They pressed the mariner's call from below, tilting it dangerously, water slamming over the deck. The crew screamed, fighting to hold their positions, but the deck was alive with chaos. Captain Thompson barked orders we barely could follow. He fired flare after flare, but the massive figure was unaffected. It pressed harder, grinding the hull, testing its strength. Nets tore, equipment smashed, and I saw Mark thrown into the rail, blood streaming down his face. One of the smaller creatures leapt aboard, sinking teeth into Pete's arm. He screamed, swinging wildly, and it disappeared into the water. I don't know how we survived. We somehow made it through the night, the storm abating with the first light. The fog lifted, the water calmed, and the creatures were gone, retreating into the depths. The damage was immense. Torn nets, deep gouges in the hull, blood stains everywhere. Captain Thompson didn't speak about it. We limped back to Gloucester in silence, haunted, shaking. The mariner's call was retired quietly. No reports, no press, no official acknowledgement. The company sold the ship for scrap, and the crew scattered. None of us returned to sea. The memory stayed with us, though, the scraping, the wet hissing, the black eyes, the hulking shape beneath the water. Even now, years later, I hear it in my dreams. The sea remembers. And those things are still out there, circling, waiting for the next ship, foolish enough to drift into their waters. Story, the end. The first time I stepped onto the Sea Wraith, she looked like she'd been dragged straight out of some old maritime nightmare. Her paint was flaking, the deck creaked under every step, and the railings rattled if the wind even whispered against them. I'd been fishing for almost a decade, worked on boats, up and down the East Coast, but This one felt different. Captain Harlan didn't waste words, just a tall, gaunt man with a sun-leathered face and eyes that seemed to stare past everything and everyone. The crew was small. Harlan, his first mate Riley, McKenna, an older deckhand who smelled like the ocean itself, and two rookies, Shane and me. We were heading 40 miles out to chase cod and haddock in deep water off the coast of Maine. It was late October, the nights already long, cold, and wet. The first night was calm. The ocean was a mirror of black under the weak moonlight, and the wind barely stirred. We set the nets deep, and the work was repetitive but manageable. McKenna muttered warnings about these waters, saying things like, "Some parts of the Gulf don't like to be bothered." I laughed, thinking he was exaggerating. Captain Harlan didn't even glance at him. Around 2 a.m., while I was checking the tension on one of the nets, the boat shuddered violently. It wasn't a wave. It was more like something massive collided with the hull beneath the water. Riley cursed and went to inspect the winch. The cable sang under tension, moving as if something below was pulling it. "This ain't a fish," McKenna muttered, voice low. I looked over the railing and saw nothing but black water. Then the line jerked again, hard, snapping my balance. I stumbled back, gripping the rail. Whatever was on that line was enormous, far larger than any cod or haddock could be. Harlan finally spoke, his voice steady but harsh. "Keep tension. Don't let it run. We'll see what it is." We cranked together, muscles straining, when suddenly the line went slack. The object let go. When we hauled the net, there was something attached to the last hook, pale, gray, rubbery. It wasn't fish. It didn't feel alive the way a fish struggles, but it had substance, muscle underneath the slick skin. The smell hit me. Sour, metallic, like wet iron mixed with decay. Shane gagged and tossed it overboard. The water around it churned violently before going calm again. The tapping started shortly after. Slow at first, then quicker, deliberate, like fingers running along the hull. I called out, but the deck was empty. McKenna's face was pale as he stared at the black water. Harlan didn't even look. He just tightened his grip on the wheel. Around 3 a.m., the boat lurched violently. Gear slid across the deck, and I had to grab a winch to keep from falling. The winch cable twanged and then thudded against the hull, as if something huge had struck it from below. I leaned over the side. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shape moved just beneath the surface, a pale, elongated figure. Its arms were too long, fingers bent in impossible angles. Its eyes, dark and unblinking, reflected the moonlight. The gills along its neck flared as it rose toward the deck. Its mouth opened wide, not like a fish, not like any animal I'd seen, but like a grotesque imitation of a human scream. Shane froze. Riley shouted. McKenna yelled something I couldn't hear. Harlan ran to grab a flare gun. I followed. He fired. The flare lit the water and deck in red, and the creature recoiled with a wet, hollow shriek. It slipped beneath the waves, leaving the sea churning for several minutes before settling into an unnatural calm. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. The tapping, scraping, and occasional thumps against the hull continued, relentless. Every creak of the boat sounded like it was responding to something below. Every shadow in the water made me flinch. I could feel it moving beneath us, waiting, patient. The second night was worse. Fog rolled in, thick as wool, swallowing the horizon. Around 1:30 a.m., the winch started pulling violently on its own. I ran to it with Riley, but the line moved as if something enormous was thrashing beneath the surface. Then the water erupted. A pale, elongated figure surged upward, dragging part of the net with it. Its skin was slick, gray, stretching unnaturally over a body far too long and thin. The eyes were black, reflective, staring directly at us. The mouth opened impossibly wide. Riley fired the flare again. The thing shrieked and fell back into the waves, but it had already torn a section of the net. Shane screamed, Lucas froze, and McKenna muttered a prayer under his breath. The water churned violently, forming whirlpools as though the ocean itself was alive, responding to whatever had surfaced. Captain Harlan decided immediately to head back to port. He didn't speak much, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The engine struggled, coughing and sputtering, as if the sea had some unseen hand on the throttle. Every time we slowed, the water darkened beneath the hull, and I could swear I saw long fingers brushing against the sides. By the time we reached the harbor, everyone was silent. The Coast Guard inspected the boat, found minor engine damage, and chalked it up to rough seas. No one asked about the strange scratches along the hull, the lingering metallic smell, or the grooves that had appeared overnight. Harlan didn't explain. McKenna didn't speak. Shane and Lucas quit immediately. I followed soon after. Weeks later, I can still hear it, the tapping, the dragging beneath the hull. I can still see those long black eyes staring at me, gills flaring, waiting. I haven't been on a boat since. I haven't fished again. But every time I pass a dock at night, I swear I see the water darken, the surface ripple unnaturally, and I feel that patient, hungry presence just beneath, waiting for someone foolish enough to step too close. The sea wraith is still out there somewhere, prowling the depths, remembering, and I know that if I ever go back, it will remember me too. Story the end. The Raven's Call had been docked in Dutch Harbor longer than I cared to count. Rust streaked the hull like veins, and the deck planks creaked with every gust of wind. I wasn't supposed to be on her. My friend Mason called me out of the blue, said they needed an extra hand for a run to the Bering Sea. The pay was obscene, but the stories about the boat were even stranger. Boats that left port never returned, nets shredded by invisible forces, men vanishing in the night. But I had bills, and bills don't care about superstition. Captain Harlan met us at the dock, a tall man with shoulders like tree trunks and a beard that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in decades. His eyes were sharp, a pale blue that seemed to cut through the fog rolling off the water. He didn't smile. He didn't shake hands. He just said, "Get on. We leave at dawn. Move fast." The crew was small. Mason, wiry and full of nervous energy. Rick, a quiet man from Kodiak who had been working boats since he could walk, and old Sal, whose skin was leathered and hands gnarled, muttering to the sea like it would answer him back. We left port just as the sun crested the horizon, the harbor lights fading into gray morning. The first day was uneventful. The fog was thin, the sea calm, and the nets went down easily. The cod came up heavy, glimmering in the sun like broken glass. I felt the old thrill, the reason I'd always loved the water, but something was off. The boat groaned differently, the hull shifting in ways it shouldn't. By the second day, unease had settled into the crew. Nets came up with small tiers, hooks bent into unnatural shapes. Mason kept pointing out shadows beneath the water, long, pale, moving too fast for fish. Rick didn't speak, just worked silently, eyes flicking constantly toward the horizon. Sal muttered about deep waters remembering. That night, the fog thickened. Harlan ordered deck lights dimmed and warned us not to go above deck alone. But I couldn't sleep. There was a sound, low and wet, coming from beneath the hull, a slow, dragging rhythm, like something massive sliding along the bottom. I climbed up to the deck, heart hammering. The water looked calm, but I could feel the presence of something beneath, circling us. Harlan didn't answer when I shouted. He just muttered, "They don't like being watched." Sleep didn't come. I could hear the water pressing against the hull in uneven pulses, the scraping, the low thump of something massive moving just under the boat. By the third day, the tension aboard the Raven's Call was unbearable. Nets snapped for no reason, hooks twisted into impossible shapes, lines went slack. Mason swore he saw long shapes beneath the water, humanoid but wrong, bending and twisting as if made of something that shouldn't exist. Rick and I tried to laugh it off, but even I could feel the dread settling into my bones. Sal didn't leave the wheelhouse. He just stared out at the fog, whispering prayers under his breath. That night, the boat shuddered violently. Something massive had struck the hull on the starboard side. A pale, elongated figure rose briefly in the fog, head smooth, limbs too thin, eyes glowing faintly. It slipped beneath the surface before any of us could move. Mason screamed, pointing at the water. "It's taking the nets! It's taking us!" Harlan fired a flare blindly. The light sizzled against something wet and slippery, then vanished beneath the waves. The fourth day brought real horror. Mason disappeared while hauling in a line. One moment he was yelling, the next, nothing. No splash, no scream, just empty deck and a chill in the air. Sal muttered something about the deep taking what it's owed and refused to come out of the wheelhouse. Harlan's face was pale. He told me to keep working. We tried to leave the area, but the engine struggled, coughing and groaning as if resisting. Something beneath us was pressing against the hull, massive and deliberate. The water churned, pale shapes circling the boat. One rose near the bow. Its head was featureless, except for a slit that opened like a mouth. It shrieked, a high-pitched, ear-splitting scream. Rick grabbed me. "We have to jump." Harlan shook his head. "Not yet. Try to outrun them. Don't make a sound." But it was too late. The hull cracked. Water poured onto the deck. One of the pale forms wrapped around Rick's leg, yanking him into the abyss with a scream that cut through the fog. I watched, frozen, as he disappeared beneath the waves. Harlan shoved me toward the life raft. "Go! If you live, tell them!" I cut the raft loose and climbed in. The Raven's Call groaned, tilting as more shapes surfaced, circling. Harlan and Sal fought them off as best they could, swinging hooks and whatever metal they could grab, but the deck cracked entirely. The boat sank within minutes, swallowed by the foggy, black water. I drifted for hours, cold and alone, until a Coast Guard helicopter spotted me. I was the only survivor. They didn't believe my story. They never found the Raven's Call. They didn't find the bodies, but I know what I saw, and sometimes when the fog rolls in thick over the water, I swear I hear the scraping against the hull, the low whispering beneath the waves, and shapes, pale, long, and wrong, moving just beneath the surface, waiting for the next boat foolish enough to drift too far into waters no one should touch. Story the end. The Seahawk had been sitting in the docks of Dutch Harbor longer than most of the fishermen could remember. She was an old crab boat built in the mid-70s with steel plating rusted in patches and an engine that coughed and coughed before it would finally roar to life. I was hired as a deckhand for a 3-week Alaskan crab season, and the crew consisted of Captain Riley, a weathered man with a permanent squint and hands like knotted ropes; Tom, a loud, boisterous deckhand who swore at everything from ropes to the weather; Henry, a quiet engineer who barely spoke above a whisper; and Jimmy, a young guy from Oregon who was eager but green. That made 6 of us, counting me. We left the harbor on a gray morning, the air biting cold and carrying the smell of diesel and salt. The first day was typical: hauling traps, checking lines, and bracing against the wind. Nothing unusual, just the monotony of the Bering Sea. But I could feel the boat's age as we cut through the dark, restless water. Every sway seemed exaggerated, the steel groaning as though it resented carrying us. Captain Riley didn't comment. He never did. By the second day, the weather had worsened. Fog rolled in, thick and heavy, blanketing everything in white. The sea was calm in patches, almost too calm, the waves barely disturbing the hull. It was then I first heard the noise. At first, I thought it was the ship settling, a groan from the steel plates. But the sound didn't match the sway or the waves. It was low, deliberate, almost like something scraping along the bottom of the hull. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining it, but I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that didn't belong to the engine. That night, we set the last trap of the day. I stayed on deck while Henry checked the engines below. Tom was fiddling with a line when the scraping returned, louder, sharper, more intentional. The water around the boat rippled unnaturally, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a shadow beneath the surface, moving against the current. I froze. The shadow vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the still water and a creeping dread. The next morning, the first trap came up shredded. Not torn by rocks, not nibbled by crabs or seals. Shredded. The mesh was twisted, shredded cleanly, and the bait was gone. Captain Riley leaned over, inspected the trap, then said, "Reset it. Don't let it bother you." He didn't explain, didn't offer theories, and we all knew better than to ask. Something was out there, but speaking about it made it real, and he didn't want it real. By the third night, the fog had thickened even further. The Seahawk felt like it was floating in a void. I was on watch with Jimmy, scanning the water and the fog with a flashlight. The scraping returned, closer now, circling beneath us. The hull groaned violently, and I felt it reverberate through the soles of my boots. Suddenly, something slammed against the port side. The deck lurched, and a crate flew past my head. Jimmy shouted and stumbled toward the railing. A massive swell of water erupted from the side of the boat. I grabbed him, dragging him back, and the shadow beneath the water moved again. Long, dark, sleek, impossible to measure. My stomach turned cold. Whatever it wasn't a seal. Not a whale, not anything I'd ever seen. Captain Riley appeared on deck, shouting orders, his eyes scanning the fog with a sharp intensity I had never seen from him before. "Secure the traps! Everyone inside! Now!" We scrambled below deck, but the Seahawk wasn't safe down there either. The hull shuddered violently as if the thing beneath was testing it, ramming from below, looking for weaknesses. Water began seeping in through small cracks, dark and oily, smelling sour. Hours passed in near darkness. We huddled in the galley, shoving tables and crates against the doors for reinforcement. Outside, the hull groaned and creaked, the sound mingling with the scraping and low, inhuman groans that rose from beneath the boat. It was deliberate, intelligent. We could feel it watching, waiting. Around 2 a.m., the first man went overboard. Tom had ventured above to check a trap despite Captain Riley's orders. There was a sudden impact against the hull, a scream, and then he was gone, swallowed by the black water. His oilskin floated briefly before disappearing into the depths. None of us dared go after him. We just watched in horror, frozen by fear and disbelief. Captain Riley didn't hesitate. "Everyone below, now!" We obeyed, shaking, terrified. The scraping intensified. Something large slid beneath the hull, circling, testing us. It struck again, the hull pitching violently. The Seahawk felt alive, bending and shuddering under the invisible assault. The water in the bilge rose rapidly, cold and dark, lapping at our boots. By dawn, the fog began to lift, revealing the wreckage of our traps and the damage to the hull. 2 men were missing. The deck was scarred, scratched deep as if claws had torn it. Captain Riley didn't speak as we assessed the damage. He only steered the Seahawk back toward Dutch Harbor, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting the shadow to follow. The Coast Guard inspected the boat when we returned. They cited structural damage and bad weather, wrote off the missing men as accidents at sea. Nobody asked questions. Nobody wanted to know what had actually happened. Weeks later, I heard rumors from other crews. Boats disappearing without a trace, nets shredded beyond repair, crews vanishing in the fog. The Bering Sea had always been dangerous, but something had changed. Something was out there, patient, intelligent, and hungry. I haven't returned to that fishing season since. I work inland now, far from the docks, far from the cold and the fog, but sometimes in the dead of night I can still hear it, the low, intelligent groan, the subtle vibrations beneath metal, the sense that something waits in the depths, patient, watching, hungry. And I know the Seahawk is not the only boat it has tested. There will be others. It is only a matter of time before it claims them too. Story the end.